Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this week's episode of Horns, we hear from the authors of a recent article in TNSR entitled The Truth About Tripwires, Why Small Force Deployments Do Not Deter Aggression. The question of tripwire forces figures largely in deterrence literature, including in the work of Thomas Schelling, but as our guests today author, their effect may have been overestimated. I'll let our guests, Professor Paul Poast and Professor Dan Reiter, introduce themselves, and then we'll get to the meat of the argument. Paul, why don't you start?
Great, yeah. So I'm Paul Poast. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. I am also a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council of Global Affairs.
Great. And Dan?
Hello, my name is Dan Reiter. I'm the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Political Science at Emery University.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate having you guys on the show today, and thanks very much for your article. And for any of our readers who haven't yet read the TNSR article but want a shorter version to tease and get them excited about it, I would also commend to them a version, not exactly a condensed version of the article, but a spinoff from the article that echoes the primary argument, which ran recently on War on the Rocks, our sister publication. So I guess if I could ask you both to begin just by summarizing the main argument and what it is that you're arguing here and why you feel it was an argument that was important to be made.
The large question we're trying to ask is, what are the causes of deterrence success? And in particular, we're trying to understand how can countries deter attacks on territories abroad and also on the territory of allies. And the argument that we're examining is the idea that the deployment of relatively small numbers of troops to foreign territories might be sufficient to deter an attack. This is an argument that was developed during the Cold War, especially by Thomas Schelling, and in practice in U.S. foreign policy. And the idea was, especially in the Eisenhower administration, that Eisenhower, under the New Look policy, wanted to reduce American spending, reduce American troop deployments abroad, but was still very concerned about communist aggression. And one of the means to restrict deployments and costs while still deterring aggression was this idea that if we deployed even a small number of troops to places like West Berlin or perhaps Taiwan, then the prospect of the deaths of those troops, even a small number, might be adequate to deter aggression, because the assumption is if a handful of Americans are killed, it'll sort of incur broader intervention. And our argument is that this tripwires proposition that the deployment of small troops to deter aggression is not terribly persuasive based on empirical evidence. That is, both case studies as well as some survey experiment. And so the main point we're making is that if a country like the United States wants to deter attacks on foreign territories, it is much more likely to successfully deter if it deploys a larger number of troops sufficient to shift the local balance of power and to slow down an attack, giving the United States enough time to deploy larger numbers of troops. That is much more likely to achieve deterrence, whereas the deployment of a small number of troops whose function is merely to be killed in battle, that is not likely to deter aggression. So that's the theoretical argument. And then within the paper, as we'll talk about later in this conversation, we apply the case to the North Korean decision not to attack South Korea in 1949, the decision to attack South Korea in 1950, and the outbreak of World War I in 1914. And then we also, again, we'll talk about this more later in the discussion, we also apply it to a number of contemporary issues of U.S. foreign policy.
I'm curious, a lot of people begin when they study deterrence by looking at deterrence failure. What caused you guys to want to look at deterrence success as your entering argument?
Yeah, so I can take on that because one of the reasons why I became involved in this project. And there were a variety of reasons that I wanted to start working on this, not least of which is that Dan and I would have conversations about it. We'd say, this is an interesting question. We really need to grapple with it. But for me, part of the reason why the starting point was looking at success was because of work that I had recently finished. I had published a book arguing about alliances that came out in 2019. And it was about a different type of failure. It was about the failure of states to agree to form military alliances, that they would come to the table, they would negotiate, and there were times where they would just walk away and say, we're not going to do this. We're not going to agree to this. And that became intriguing to me was, well, what determines when those negotiations end in success or end in failure? And one of the key things that I was finding, and that I argue in the book, is that these negotiations are often over war plans. When we think about alliances, we think about the signaling function of alliances. And we'll talk more about signaling and signaling function of alliances today, because it's a big part of where the tripwire literature fits in. But for me, that's not really what's brought up in these negotiations. What they're talking about in these negotiations is if, heaven forbid, we actually have to use force jointly, how are we going to do it? What are our plans? What are our objectives? Who are we actually going to target? And a big part of that is, of course, deployment of troops. Of like, well, how many troops are you going to contribute? How many troops am I going to contribute? Where are they going to go? Where are they going to be based? Where are they going to be housed? And that leads into then discussions about, should we have them deployed ahead of time, right? Is that a key part of this? And that could be a key part of the negotiation before the treaty's even signed, before they even become official allies. That could be part of the negotiations. So I was intrigued by that solely for the sake of figuring out how they got to yes. But then I wanted to start looking at the implications of that. Okay, they've reached yes in some of these instances. Of course, other instances they say no, and then they walk away. But when they say yes, and they say this is how we're going to do it, and now we're going to have troops based there, what's the implication for that? And what does that mean for the alliance to actually effectively serve as a deterrent? And that was what led us to, and that's what led me to want to start working with Dan to start thinking about, okay, if one of the provisions in the treaty is we're going to have troops based here, which of course that's a common feature of the US alliance system, is having forward deployed troops, how many is actually necessary to achieve the end of deterrence? And as Dan was highlighting here, there's this literature about, well, you don't really need that many. You can have just a small token force and they will serve as this tripwire. They will have the purpose of, as Schelling said, to die, and that will bring in the cavalry. But really, is that the case? Because that doesn't sound like a good, effective war plan. If you're actually sitting there negotiating, coming up with a plan of how you're going to defeat the enemy, saying, okay, here's our plan. Some of our troops are going to die, and then we'll come in and have the cavalry. That doesn't sound like that works very well. So that was kind of the way that I started to enter into this project. And I know Dan had, his own reasons for wanting to engage in this project as well.
Dan, would you care to share those with us?
One of my mentors, once told me that he doesn't care, where you get your research ideas. They come from all angles. And, what was nice for me about this project is there were lots of different angles motivating me to think about this. And we'll get into this later in the conversation. Part of it was just, trying to get into these historical cases to really kind of unpack some puzzles. Why did Germany attack in 1914? And, why did the Korean War break out when it did and so forth? And then also part of it is a theoretical puzzle to try to take apart the logic of, the tripwire theory and kind of lay the pieces on the table and understand it. And the other part is a policy part, because, Doyle, you said, why do you study deterrence success? And, one of the reasons is that if we have what looks like a successful policy, we draw inferences as to why it succeeded and we try to repeat it. And one thing that I was thinking about when we started working on this paper is that currently, the United States is facing a very similar strategic environment in which there are a number of territories around the world, we would like to defend against aggression. We don't want to deploy lots of troops. And there's a temptation to make relatively minor troop deployments to places like, the Baltics and South China Sea and so forth. And so for me, there's a real direct foreign policy question, which is assuming you want to deter aggression on these places, you want to do it on the cheap. Are tripwire deployments an effective way to go? So for me, that's just kind of a policy question I wanted to try to get a better understanding of.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned, and we've alluded to, the contemporary echoes of this are extremely relevant in terms of helping to inform the shape of U.S. policy, not only in the sort of classic tripwire theater of Europe, but even more so in Asia, where the alliance structure is different, which changes the calculations about moral hazard and other things like that we'll discuss later. But I do want to ask a little bit about your case selection, because if you raise the question of tripwire forces, and I have to use the phrase that Schelling used at one point because he called them a plate glass window, which I just love, that image that once it's broken, it can't be put back together. The example that comes to many people's minds first, the example that Schelling drew on, is that of Korea throughout the Cold War. And you address that briefly in the introduction of the article as you engage with Schelling, but you looked elsewhere for the cases that you explored. And I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about your case selection criteria and methodology, and if there was a conscious choice not to engage with the Berlin example, if for some reason that was not a good example of the type of phenomenon that we're looking at here.
Yeah, let me jump in on the Berlin part, and then I'll kind of pass the mic over to Paul to talk about the other cases. This was one of the most surprising parts of this project, is how wrong Schelling was about Berlin. And the reason that we didn't include it is because, and this is a little bit in the weeds in terms of social sciences, we're trying to look at cases of deterrence, success, and failure. When one state was considering launching an attack, and then it either launched an attack, that's deterrence failure, or didn't launch an attack, that's deterrence success. And as it turns out that Schelling was writing in the 60s, and his only base of knowledge as to what the Russians and the East Germans were doing at that point is just news reports, for obvious reasons. They're closed societies. You can't interview leaders and so forth. But after the Cold War ended, there was this huge release of primary documents from the communist bloc about Cold War decision-making, minutes of meetings, things like that, diplomatic communiques, very high-quality primary evidence. And that evidence very clearly indicates that Moscow had no interest in attacking West Berlin and using force against West Berlin, either during the 1948-49 airlift crisis or during the 1961 so-called Berlin Wall crisis. And so that to me was, and we do mention this in the paper, we provide the documentation for the interested readers. And so for me, it's a really interesting larger lesson. And I think that we do this all the time, not just social scientists, but, every people in everyday life, where you come to have like an understanding of how things work. And that understanding sometimes turns on a specific pattern or specific historical episode. And we take it for granted. Well, that's just the way it works. That's just the way the housing crisis exploded in 2008. That's just the way that peace was kept in Berlin in 1961. And we don't really explore the guts of those assumptions. And so for me, like getting into the Berlin case sort of demonstrated the importance of, not accepting assumptions at face value and digging into them. So that was something which is very surprising about the project for me. And then also kind of more narrowly, that's why we talk about the Berlin case more in passing rather than in as much depth as we do the Korean and the 1914 cases.
I love that explanation, because I think one of the challenges in defining a deterrent success is that by definition, you're looking for something that didn't occur. And that's one of the great challenges in deterrence. I know when I've taught deterrence to students, there's a Sesame Street clip I love to use where Ernie has a banana in his ear and Bert asks why, and he says it's to keep the alligators away. And purchased. There are no alligators on Sesame Street. He says, see, it's working. And, it's this great challenge of how do you define when it was a deterrent success versus when there was nothing to be deterred. And I guess, Paul, that would segue into how you guys did choose the cases that you chose.
Yeah. So the one case that for me made me very excited about this project for looking at it. I mean, we look really at three cases. We look at from the standpoint of cases that I think most people would say, yes, that's a reasonable case to look at. We look at the case of the Korean Peninsula and really look at an instance of deterrent success and then deterrence failure. And of course, that deterrence failure is then the start of the Korean War itself. And Dan can say a little bit more about that case. The other case we look at was one that some folks go, that's an interesting case to look at. And the reason why is because it's very much a counterfactual thinking case. And that is the case, right? I mean, isn't all of security studies just a study of World War I, right? So, and that's the case that we look into is the onset of World War I. And specifically what we're asking in that case, and this is what makes it a little bit different, but we found very compelling evidence along the lines of what Dan was saying, which is the idea that you want to look at a case where a side has interest to actually engage in the action, and you have to think about deterring them. Now, this was a clear instance of deterrence failure, but to really understand the logic of tripwire, we really do have to think about the counterfactual. That case is, of course, the case of the beginning in 1914 and Germany's invasion of Belgium and then going into France. And the counterfactual here is to think, could the British have stopped it? And not stopped it by using force, but could they have prevented it by deploying troops ahead of time? Now, the tricky things about this particular counterfactual is, first of all, there was a huge political issue. The political issue was the Belgian government was not going to allow British troops on their territory, right? And indeed, when we've shared this case and we would present it at conferences, so forth, that would be the number one thing people bring up. Well, this is ridiculous. Like the Belgian government wouldn't allow it. And we'd say, that's exactly right. We understand that. What we're saying is, what if they had recognized that, oh, wait a minute, if we allow British troops on our territory, that could actually have a benefit to us because it would have prevented Germany from invading, right? What if the Belgian government had known that how history was going to play out? They probably would have changed their mind and said, yes, we will allow the British troops to be there. And so what we want to know is if the Belgian government had allowed British troops to be there, and if the British were willing to pre-deploy their troops, those are two big ifs. But if they did, would it have worked? And for us, we think that that's an intriguing case for thinking about pre-deployment of troops and forward deployment of troops. And what we see from the evidence is that, yes, it would have worked because the German war plan was predicated on speed. The German war plan, as is commonly referred to as the Schlieffen Plan, is about this quick maneuver, hook maneuver through Belgium, through northern France, and then they would finish off France within 6 weeks and then be able to redirect all their forces towards Russia because Russia would take a lot more time to mobilize. So even though Russia was actually the primary threat, they were worried about getting into a two-front war. They thought they could quickly knock out France. But the key word there is quickly. They thought that they could do this fast. And in fact, when they were planning for it, you can see this in documents, they talk time and time again about the necessity of speed. It has to be done quickly. The British also know this. Like, this is not like a secret thing. Like, they know that, hey, for Germany to do this, they would have to be able to attack quickly. But the reason why this is important is this is part of the reason why the German government was not worried about British intervention. Because that's another thing that's often been brought up is that, well, the Germans didn't seem deterred by the prospects of British intervention into the war. Why would they have been deterred by pre-deployment? We say, well, that's because you have to understand the difference. The difference is British intervention means once Germany's already executing, they're already in the process of executing their plans. Now the British start sending in troops, but by then it's too late. The point to pre-deployment is that you have the troops already there before the thing even happens. And now the German government would have to sit there and go, okay, can we actually execute this with a battalion of British troops sitting there, right? And the answer would be no, we can't. Speed is too important. This can't be done. We cannot execute this. And so that's the counterfactual that we're putting forward there is that we see this deterrence failure And we make the argument that the reason why there was deterrence failure was because the threat of intervention was not enough. It really had to be the physical pre-deployment of British troops. That would have been enough to deter Germany. And so that's why we think that this is a good case for thinking about the usefulness of pre-deployment of troops.
Would it be fair to paraphrase that as that the intervention threat was a political threat, no different than the signaling value of pre-deployment, whereas the military obstacle posed by pre-deployment is what you feel would have been determinative?
Absolutely, 100%. That it was really about, kind of goes back to the notion I was talking about earlier regarding war plans. And it really is about effectively, this is an effective use of the troops. And that is really what deters. It's not about the signaling. It's not about a show of resolve, if you will. It's not about that. The Germans weren't concerned about a show of resolve. They knew the British were resolved. They knew that the British would come in if they invaded Belgium. That wasn't the issue. The issue wasn't to know, or at least that's what they suspected, right? They said, no, the British were going to intervene. We know that. We know their resolve to defend Belgium, but we don't care because they're not going to be able to stop the actual execution of our war strategy. And so to counter that, you have to counter it with a war strategy, which in this case here is the pre-deployment of troops. So yes, I think that's a very good paraphrasing kind of what we're talking about.
And Dan, can you talk a little bit about the two Korean examples?
The Korean cases work very well for us. And, from a social science point of view, it's a really nice pair of examples. Sort of a most similar case, as a social scientist would say, because the same country over a limited time period, and then what we see is a change in our independent variable from 1949 to 1950, where the United States has a sizable troop deployment to South Korea in 1949, and then decides to substantially draw it down to a very small force in 1950. And so the theory would predict that North Korea would not attack in 1949 and would attack in 1950. And that is exactly what the evidence shows, that North Korea and the communist leadership in Beijing and Moscow considered attacking in 1949. And if you go inside of the primary documents, it clearly indicates that Stalin is very concerned about the presence of U.S. forces. And then as the forces get drawn down, then this facilitates an attack in 1950. So from a kind of a social science, structure, it works really well. There are some other reasons why this case was so intriguing. One is that, and this is another surprise for me in working on this project, is I think most people would agree that the Korean War is probably one of the most important wars of the 20th century in terms of starting the Cold War and being so destructive to hundreds of thousands of people and so forth. And there is a substantial amount of international relations research on some parts of the Korean War, such as, why did China intervene? Why did the war end when it did, and so forth. There is almost nothing in IR research on why North Korea attacked. There's a lot of historical work, but there is almost nothing. There's like 2 pages in John Mearsheimer's first book, and that's about it as to why North Korea attacked. And so, that was a big surprise that no one had ever tried to understand, this very important historical episode. And there's really nothing on why North Korea did not attack in 1949, which is also a tremendously interesting puzzle. So we saw this as an opportunity to fill this very large lacuna in IR research, applying IR theory to understand a very important historical event. And then a last point I'll make about the Korea case is that, understanding the outbreak of the Korean War has contemporary policy relevance, because that is one of the main tripwire debates. And certainly during the Trump administration, there was loud talk about drawing down, the U.S. troop presence in South Korea to save money and so forth. And, one of the arguments could be you could take the Schelling tripwire logic and say, all we really need in South Korea is about 1,000 Americans deployed near the Korean border. That would be enough to deter North Korean attack. And so for us, talking about what happened in 1949 and 1950, that would help enrich the debate about what policy we should have in 2021 in terms of U.S. deployments to South Korea. So yeah, so for me, there were a lot of reasons why the historical cases of Korea in 1949, 1950, suited our purposes quite well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And somewhere, Dean Acheson's speechwriter is thanking you for explaining that this was about a calculation of military balance, not the National Press Club speech.
Well, that's something that we really dove into in the paper, because that's the alternative argument explanation as to why North Korea attacked, is because the speech was some kind of green light. And what we discovered is that it's a much more complicated than that. When he made the speech in January 1950, it was misreported in the Western media that it was not a green light. And Stalin initially, dismissed the speech, saying it was a bunch of lies. So it was, and from what we know, it's not the case that the speech was read and then the communist governments immediately said, okay, we had a red light, now we have a green light. And that was kind of the contemporary understanding. It's like, why did the communists attack in 1950? It's because of the Acheson speech, end of story. And reality is a lot more complicated.
And I think that's a good lead in, because your paper really challenges a lot of the reputation and resolve literature. And by implication, it also throws some interesting wrenches into a lot of the alliance literature. And, I'm thinking obviously Lieber and Press. Ian Henry is doing some really interesting stuff on this down in Australia. Danielle Upton has a terrific book on reputation for resolve. And I guess I'm wondering, in your view, is there still a role for resolve and reputation here, or is it almost exclusively about the military utility of the forces, or do they interact in some way?
That's a big question with respect to alliances. And I 100% agree that it does force us to kind of rethink all this stuff. And the reason why it forces us to rethink is not even just in this paper. To me, this paper, as I was sharing before, is kind of an extension of the work that I was doing for the book that I wrote, Arguing About Alliances. And I remember when I was writing that book, when I was working on it, I remember I was at a workshop, and Ben Fordham was at this workshop. Ben Fordham's been, he's done so much great work on the political economy and security and alliances, so on and so forth. And I remember him reading this, and he goes, "This makes a lot of sense to me." He goes, because when states sit down, these guys sit down and negotiate, they're not talking about what signal are we sending to here and how are we doing that. They're like, no, what are we going to do when we actually fight? That's what this is about. It's really about the balance of forces here. This is what they're really talking about. And so much of the literature, let me put it to you like this. It's not that IR scholars don't know this, right? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion. There's a lot of literature about alliances, alliance capability, about how alliances, capability aggregation, right? That's one of the most classic discussions about what alliances do. But what happened is we became more and more and more focused on the signaling aspect of alliances. And I think part of that could even be traced back to the 1990s when Jim Fearon wrote his paper about tying hands or sunk costs, right? And he talked about how alliance treaties are a form of tying your hands. It's this audience cost type of signal. And then he gave even an example of sunk costs as mobilizing troops, right? So he's using alliances as kind of key examples of these policies. And I think that led people to really focus on that aspect of alliances, that it's about the signal of resolve and the signal, it's establishing what we do. When it's like, no, it's actually really much more about the capability part. That's what this is about. That it's about, at the end of the day, you can have on paper that something's going to happen, but how do you know? And by you, I mean maybe the adversary. How do they know they're actually going to fulfill this treaty? To me, I look at it like this. So for me, alliance treaties are one of the most difficult types of treaties when it comes to thinking about alliances, or when it comes to thinking about compliance. And the reason why is because for a lot of treaties, normal times are full of lots of opportunities to test the credibility of them, right? A trade treaty. You sign a trade treaty, it's like, look, we're going to get regular data about whether or not you're complying with this. There might be some noise around it. We might have to think about it that way, but we're going to get regular data. When it comes to an alliance treaty, a lot of times you sign it and then you hope. You hope it never gets tested and so on and so forth. So the question is, how do you know that it's actually going to be fulfilled? Well, it's not about the way you know that is you see, do the sides actually start planning together? Do they actually start doing exercises together? That's why military exercises are important. It's not so much that it's about signaling resolve, it's about actually making sure that you can fulfill the obligations of the alliance, right? That your capabilities can actually work together. You can actually execute a war plan. Forward deploying troops is another one of these ways of actually putting into place the things necessary to actually carry out the alliance treaty, and does it in a way that doesn't require just waiting for the time when maybe it'll actually be called on. And remember that Article 5 has only been invoked one time, right? So that's a long time to go to be hoping for the core of it to be fulfilled. So yeah, I think that to me, this literature in a kind of is part of a variety of literature I've been working on in alliances, where it really does kind of raise questions about this reputation signaling function of alliances, and that component, not that it's not there at all, but it has been way overemphasized compared to the capability component to it.
Dan, did you want to add on the reputation piece?
This has really caused me to think a lot about the reputation stuff. And you know, if you go back to like the literature from the 50s and 60s, you know, the stuff about reputation, you know, Schelling and Ellsberg and Kahn and these other guys, it is such a seductively persuasive set of arguments because the logic is just so tight. You know, you've got uncertainty about there's an incentive to lie. You have to figure out these ways to signal, costly signaling, and so on and so on and so forth. And the logic is just beautifully tight and beautifully seductive. And this certainly flows into the 90s and the zeros. You know, Paul mentioned Jim Farron's work, and you know, that and work by Jim Moore and some other folks is just, you know, hugely seductive. The problem is, even though the logic is really seductive, that may not be the way the world works. I mean, Marxism, the logic of Marxism is hugely seductive, but that's just not the way the world works. This is something that, you know, Paul and I have talked about a lot, that it would be nice if the world worked that way, but it just doesn't. And as far as the reputation part, one, you know, I'll make a couple of points. I mean, there is a huge amount of very careful experimental and survey work from Josh Kurtzer and some other folks who are just showing that reputation just doesn't work the way that we all think it does. You know, like you take some action and then you're drawing inferences and so forth. It just doesn't work that way. And, you know, Daryl Press's first book really nicely showed, in my view, that reputation doesn't work that way in terms of credibility in some of the most important international crises of the 20th century, including, you know, the 1930s, you know, crisis involving Germany. You know, Ted Hopp, his first book is a great book showing in the Vietnam War. He looked at thousands of documents from Moscow that showed that the Soviets were not drawing the inferences we thought they would be drawing based on what we were doing in the Vietnam War. Okay, they weren't kind of carefully observing what we were doing and saying, okay, that shows American toughness, that shows American weakness, and so forth. The world just doesn't work that way. I really think, you know, where this project is going is alongside a lot of other work, which is basically saying the logic of reputation theory, it's all very tight, it's all very persuasive, but it's just not the way the world works, right? And this is just yet another way, another kind of piece of that wall of empirical data that this thing, the tripwire, you know, deployment, which is supposed to convey resolve, yeah, it makes a lot of sense logically, but it just doesn't work that way. And what's interesting is there's a survey experiment from some colleagues of ours who, you know, try to see if the assumptions are right. You know, that if a handful of troops are killed in a foreign deployment, does that make the public more likely to support broader intervention? And the answer is that it doesn't. You know, and we show lots of instances from, you know, U.S. contemporary history where it had the opposite effect, where killing a handful of troops caused people to say, you know what, we need to withdraw, whether it was after the 93 Battle of Mogadishu or the 83 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, and so on and so forth. I think this is, I mean, we're not the first ones to make this point, so I don't mean to overstate what we're doing. I think we're part of a stream of research, which is saying you can't take the reputation theory logic at face value. You have to go look at the data, and the data shows the world is much more complicated than the crystal palace of reputation logic would have us believe.
Yeah, I think one of the real challenges there, and part of why it's so seductive, as you said, is that it has this intuitive appeal because it essentially scales up human interactions at the individual level to the state level. And while leaders are individuals, states don't behave in the same way that individuals do for a variety of reasons, because of a variety of constituencies that need to be satisfied and other considerations that come in. I'm wondering, as we start to move into the final third of the podcast, if we can talk a little bit about the contemporary implications here, because I think, to summarize the logic that you've laid out, there's no such thing as a military free lunch. I'm not going to be able to achieve deterrence by denial with the threat of, gee, something bad will happen because I've deployed this small number of forces here. I'm going to need a militarily significant deployment of forces if I hope to have a deterrent effect, whether that significance is to defeat or simply to slow, but something that is more than just skin in the game. And so as we look at both Europe and Asia, we see slightly different logics working because of different alliance structures. But I think we see at times a desire to get that low-cost solution. And I'm wondering how you view the implications of your work here in those theaters.
So I can take a first cut at that, especially focusing on Europe. And I think a good way to think about this, obviously, because you're exactly right, that this was a big part of the Trump administration's push, was to try to remove U.S. troops from Europe. And also, admittedly, some of that was just repositioning too. Like, okay, we're going to position more troops into Poland than compared to where they are in Germany and whatnot. But I think a good way to start with this, and maybe it's a little overly dramatic, I don't know, but I'll just start this way, because I've done this before when I've given an address. I gave an address where I opened up and I said that if I were to give a presentation to a sitting U.S. president about the importance of American alliances, and in particular the importance of NATO in Europe, the presentation would have a single slide with a single picture. And that picture is the American cemetery in Normandy. And what I would say is, if you do not want more of these, you need to maintain NATO. That would be my argument. And then I'd probably just walk out the room, be like, that's it. that's the argument, right? But the argument is that relying solely on reputation, relying solely on, oh, well, of course the U.S. has resolve and they'll come to Europe's aid. And, if, say, Russia became aggressive, they'll come to the Baltics' aid, right? That's not how it works. How it works is you need to make sure that there are troops there, that American troops are there to help deter Russian attack. Russia knows that the U.S. would like to stop a Russian attack, but can they actually do it? Especially because something we haven't yet talked about, but it actually plays a key role in our paper, is the notion of fait accompli, right? That a lot of times when we think about invasion, and we think about, say, Russia attacking the Baltic states, we think about rolling through and they're going to conquer the whole country and do this. But a lot of times that's not how these things work. A lot of times how it works is they're trying to do something like they did with Ukraine, right? We're just going to move in troops quickly, take Crimea, no single shots are even fired. But by the time you even get a chance to respond, we've already got the high ground, right? That's the idea behind a fait accompli. The only way to stop that is to stop it before it starts. Is to even sit there and say, there are troops here to where it's not even possible for you to conduct that kind of maneuver. And that's really the concern in the Baltic states, on the eastern flank, as they like to call it, of NATO, is the possibility of Russia conducting a fait accompli. But if you allow that to happen, now all of a sudden you do end up in a situation where could they then conduct another? Could they conduct another? Now you've created a heightened security environment. So that's a big reason why you need to maintain these forward deployed troops. and why it's important that the U.S. continue to take on that role. Now, admittedly, is it possible that the U.S. could not have troops still be in NATO and say, you know what, we're not going to have the troops there. We're going to rely on the NATO allies to do this. This gets into the whole notion of burden sharing, right? Is that something that the U.S. fully wants to do? Fully rely on the Europeans to provide for their own security, even within the context of NATO. Be like, we will provide logistical support, but you all are responsible fully for providing the military capability to carry this out. And my sense is that that is not something the U.S. wants to do, that U.S. commanders would be like, no, we don't want to be in a situation where we're relying on the war plans and capabilities of our European partners. We would like to have a say in that. And the best way to have a say in it is to actually be the ones providing the troops for it. So for me, that's kind of a key implication of this research when thinking about the European theater. And I know Dan has thoughts about this as it pertains to Asia.
Yeah, Asia is a very dangerous place for American interests. North Korea is a very real threat to South Korea. China has been quite open in its willingness to be aggressive in the South China Sea, and more observers are becoming concerned about the possibility of an overt Chinese attack on Taiwan. Never mind, more minor concerns like a variety of territorial disputes between China and Japan and so forth. And so, the implication of our paper, in terms of what you said, Doyle, about the free lunch, is that if America wants to protect its security interests, it has to, make real commitments and commit real resources and plan to win. The U.S. Eighth Army in South Korea, their motto is "Fight tonight." Okay, and by that they mean we are prepared to fight right now. And the reason that the war games, as alluding to something Paul said, that war games with the South Korean military are so important to the U.S. military is that that's not a signaling function. That's not some kind of trick in which we're sending this oblique signal to North Korea that we're really committed. That is to improve military preparedness. That is to help the U.S. and South Korea fight as effectively as possible if war were to come. Okay, and that's really the drift of our paper. Is we're not making kind of the normative judgment that we should send tens of thousands of troops to defend our interests in the South China Sea or whatever. We're just saying that if you decide that you want to maintain an independent Taiwan or you want to maintain an independent South Korea, then you have to plan to win on the ground locally, or at least shift the local, balance of forces. Now, in Asia, this is probably a relatively non-controversial point to say, yeah, we need to prevent Taiwan and South Korea from being attacked. We have almost 30,000 troops in South Korea, and we'll do what we need to do to prevent Taiwan from being overrun. The trickier area is probably the South China Sea. Okay, we're there. That's different than South Korea or Taiwan. There aren't people who live in the South China Sea. It's that's not really covered by U.S. alliance commitments. It's clearly an area where China has a big sphere of influence, and policymakers need to have a debate as to how important it is from U.S. foreign policy interests to curtail Chinese aggression there. And what Paul and I would say is, once you decide on what you want to do there, then you can make decisions about troop deployments. And we would say, don't sort of have wishful thinking that all we have to do is sort of have a picket line of, destroyers or something, or a handful of troops, and that'll be sufficient to deter Chinese aggression. If you want to deter, you have to plan to win. Otherwise, you're just kind of fooling yourself, and you're setting yourself up for a foreign policy that may fail to deter. So I think that I would hope that our argument has a lot to say about how the U.S. should think about protecting its interests in East Asia as well as in Europe.
Yeah, and the South China Sea example, I think, just highlights the salience of the fait accompli question. Because, of course, in the question of the artificial island construction and the militarization of those structures, that has occurred. And so that is not an action that can be deterred. It could be reversed, perhaps further expansion could be deterred. But to deter it militarily would require a fairly substantial risk tolerance for committing U.S. forces in ways that could be escalatory.
Well, you could do it. I mean, you could send a bunch of ships and send a bunch of carriers, but you just have to recognize, the costs and the dangers.
And, another point, I want to build on something that Dan was just saying about the normative implications of it and how we're not making this normative argument. There's another angle to this. And we don't talk about this in this paper, though it's been brought up in other contexts when I've thought about this paper, talked about this issue, which is, well, how does this relate to something like Afghanistan, right? Where we're now withdrawing U.S. troops. And my argument is that these are not the same things. However, you have heard people when talking about U.S. with troop withdrawals from Afghanistan saying, how is this in any way different than Germany? How is this in any way different than South Korea, right? They said, those are U.S. troops there. How is this different? Well, the difference is one of them is a hot war and the other one is not, right? The other one is a 20-year campaign that, quite frankly, is not even really a war anymore. It's become something that I've heard others use, and I've used this phrase, imperial policing type action. That's a very different situation. What we're talking about is a situation where you do not want a war to happen. You need to deploy troops in order to prevent the war from happening. That the purpose of the military is to keep the peace, not necessarily to execute or to be involved in the war. Once the war is broken out, that becomes a different calculus now. Now, ideally, you've put together a war plan to where it can be executed and you can quickly win this war. But that's a key implication I think is worth bringing out if we're talking about policy implications, because I think some people could look at our argument and say, wait a minute, what does this mean for Afghanistan? Are you saying that we should have put more troops into Afghanistan? Because that's, of course, been the argument made. And we're saying, no, Afghanistan's kind of outside our scope because that is now a situation where there's a war happening.
Yeah, and I think that also helps to highlight one of the challenges in a lot of the conventional deterrence discussions that occur is that there's a lack of clarity as to just what it is that is being deterred and a tendency to lose sight of the fact that deterrence is meant to keep a particular actor from taking a particular action under a threat of particular type of consequence and an assurance that the consequence won't befall if the action isn't taken. And there isn't such a thing as general conventional deterrence. I can't just do something to make everybody do what I want them to do all the time. So we're coming up on the end of our time, and I would just ask each of you if you have 30 seconds or a minute's worth of concluding thoughts each as you take a look at the implications of the paper.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple of words. I mean, I'll just reiterate a couple of points. One is that a general point is I think the paper points out the importance of examining assumptions and, to think about just because an argument is so logically compelling, it doesn't mean that it's right. And you have to look at the data and you have to sort of, kick over some rocks to see if your empirical assumptions are correct. So that's kind of a big kind of blue sky, 30,000 foot, conclusion that I would draw. And then the other point I would make, and I'll turn over to Paul, is that, we're trying to present here a very realistic assessment of this corner of U.S. foreign policy. And it sort of gets back to a point you made, Doyle, earlier about to avoid the temptation of the free lunch. You'd like to think you can do these things on the cheap, but that's a seductive and potentially dangerous assumption upon which to rest your foreign policy.
And I would actually build right on that point that Dan made. So a lot of my early research was in an area that I call the political economy of security, looking at war finance, how countries can afford it. And when you start studying that literature, you realize that right away, a lot of that literature deals with alliances because it gets into these burden sharing questions. And then a lot of the classic literature on that work done by economists even was exactly on the question of NATO burden sharing and so forth. And that goes directly to this point about the free lunch. It's like, can we share the burden and so forth? And to me, this what I really like about this piece, and I think a big implication from it, is it very nicely brings together the idea of alliances and the idea of thinking about the political economy of security. Because what we're saying is as Dan said earlier, is that if you have decided that you think a certain region or country or partner is in your national interest to protect, and you are going to use an alliance to protect them, and you then to realize that number one, the way to protect them is forward deployment of troops. And number two, that forward deployment of troops can't be done on the cheap. So you can, of course, yes, you want your partner to be able to help with that. You would want them to be able to provide troops and resources too. But you need to think about how many troops does it take to execute what you think is the best war plan to be able to carry this out. And quite often when it comes to the US military, that best war plan is the war plan that we control. That's the idea behind this. And so to me, that's what's compelling about this argument, is that at the end of the day, it really is kind of a political economy of security type question, which is that if you're going to forward deploy troops, it's like to say you need to go big. You need to do it in a way that actually shifts that balance of power. You can't get by on the cheap.
I appreciate those comments, and I think they're comments that are of incredible importance as we anticipate at some point the release of a new national security strategy and look at the resource pressures that push our defense spending at the same time that we look at the strategic pressures that push our commitments globally. Our guests today have been Professors Dan Reiter and Paul Poast of Emery University and the University of Chicago, respectively. They are the authors of The Truth About Tripwires, Why Small Force Deployments Do Not Deter Aggression. You can read that in Volume 4, Issue 3 of Texas National Security Review. And if you're interested in that argument and you'd like to read a shorter form expansion of it, on June 17th of 2021, they were the authors also of Death Without Deterrence, or Why Tripwire Forces Are Not Enough, which you can read on our sister publication, War on the Rocks. Dan, Paul, thank you guys both so much for taking the time today.
Thanks,
you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.